You're on mute.
I just
Okay,
said,
you're on mute.
I know. I just said I was just about to start after the introduction.
Oh, great. Okay.
We're good.
Yeah, so this lecture is probably primarily for LD and policy. You're not really going to be running critiques in public forum or parley. I mean, there's exceptions to that, and you're welcome to stay. There's learn about capitalism and neoliberalism, but for your competitive benefit, this is especially going to be for LD and policy because that's what I specialize in. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to send them out in the chat. And I will see them. I pay attention to the chat. You can also just ask them out loud if I haven't noticed your question. Feel free to interrupt me. Are you sending the definition of neoliberalism in the chat there, Kessler? We'll get to that soon. All right, so I'm going to share my screen here so y'all can see my fire PowerPoint presentation. Just kidding, it's Google Slides. Okay. Luca, this is the revolution template I was talking about earlier. Can't believe it exists. Please let me know if you're having any difficulty seeing my screen during the screen share. What? I did not, shoot. Okay, sorry about that. I'm not technologically competent at all. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about capitalism and talking about how to talk about capitalism within the debate space. So I'm going to be giving you a general guide for how to use this argument, but also I want to give you a fundamental understanding of it, because one of my largest pet peeves as a judge, and one of your judges' largest pet peeves, is going to be debaters who seek to talk about capitalism but haven't taken the time to understand it first. So after this lecture, I encourage you all to go do a little of your own research on capitalism, neoliberalism, and modern society. But like I said, this is going to be a guide to LD and policy. Up there at the top of my screen is my name and my email. I encourage you to write down my email in case you have any questions at the end of this lecture. I'll be sending it out in the chat again, but I will be happy to send you files, answers, literature, whatever you need. I already gave this preface slightly, but this lecture does assume some basic knowledge of debate structure and specifically critique structure. I think you probably all should have had the opportunity to attend Carissa's critique structure lecture. I am going to be talking about critique structure in this debate with an assumed, lecture with an assumed amount of knowledge. So I'm going to be talking about links, impacts, and alternatives. If you don't already know what those things are, I'm happy to address them if enough people are confused. But you can also look back at this recording once you have a better understanding. So this is an intermediate level K lecture, but it's still good to know this stuff. So just a little roadmap here, as we call it in debate, for those of you who like to take very organized notes. Number one, we're going to start with the basics of capitalism and understanding the theory behind the argument. I want you all to understand how capitalism and neoliberalism modify our lives in the everyday spaces. Number two, we're going to be talking about how to utilize the cap K and when to utilize the cap K. When can you leverage this argument against your opponents and when is it most strategic? Number three, we're going to be talking about theorizing alternatives for your critique. So if you are unfamiliar with what an alternative to a critique is, it is the very thing at the end that is somewhat like a counterplan, where you say, I have addressed an issue like neoliberalism, and here's how I intend to solve it, or at least do something for it. So we're going to be talking basically about what capitalism is, when you should bring it up in debate, and how you should talk about solving capitalism, or solving the harms that capitalism perpetuates. So I'm starting us off, much like yesterday, I started you all off with a quote on queer theory. If you weren't at that lecture, it's fine, but I'm starting everybody off with a quote again today by the world's most iconic anti-capitalist author, who's Karl Marx. If you are unfamiliar with Karl Marx, he wrote the Communist Manifesto. I believe every person on earth should read this just because it has such a huge impact on human history. Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, as most of you probably know, ended up leading to many different communist revolutions across the world through the last 2 centuries. So if you don't already have a basic familiarity with Karl Marx, now is the time. But here's like his literally most famous quote ever. You see a little kid? Okay, here's his most famous quote ever. Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. I want everybody to kind of take a moment here to think about what this quote means to you. Why does Karl Marx imply that workers have nothing to lose, and what chains is he referring to? If you have an answer right now, feel free to send it in the chat or say it out loud, but I'm going to give you all a minute. Yeah, go ahead, Kessler.
I think the somewhat it's metaphorical, but at the same time it's literal. What it means by chains, it means that the bonds that sort of tie you into the society, but it's harming you in a way such as overwork, stress, and depression.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So chains can be literal and metaphorical. Yeah, go ahead. I see another raised hand.
I think like this is the thing of collaboration in socialism and capitalism. Kind of idea like in capitalism, like at least kind of idea, at least to the all the money benefits on it. And like hit the 10 is like the idea of your success doesn't come about your wealth. So
Yeah,
basically saying it basically that giving everyone the opportunity regardless of how much they have instead of judging the success about your lifestyle and capitalism will be.
that is a great answer. Yeah, opportunity within capitalism is very limited. Talking about how capitalism impacts the individual and impacts our individual opportunity is a great point. Does anybody else have something they'd like to add? Oh, I see something in the chat. Okay, poor people are disadvantaged and have nothing to lose because death is better than living that way. Yeah, that's a great point. So, the perspective of some anti capitalists is that capitalism is a system that drives us all towards misery, or that capitalism is a system that commodifies all of us and makes us less than human. In the chat. Yeah. So, these are all really good, comments on this quote. If you have anything else to add, I'd love to hear it in the comments or, whatever you call the chat. So go ahead and throw it out there throughout this lecture. If something comes to you, and we're going to be coming back to this at the end probably, but I do have another quote for you at the end. So with that in mind, what is capitalism exactly? We talk a lot about capitalism in the modern day, especially in the context of the revolutionary politics that are beginning to emerge. But the outright definition of capitalism is probably a little different than you expect. So capitalism is entirely just an economic system. Capitalism as a system does not refer to politics. Capitalism does not refer to ideology. It is commonly understood to be an economic system where the means of production are privately owned for profit. Does everybody know what means of production are? If anybody would like to give me an example, go ahead and throw it on out there of what an example of what means of production are. It can be literal, metaphorical.
Amazon?
Amazon? Well, sort of. I would say that the means of production in Amazon could be owning those Amazon, like Jeff Bezos owns all of those Amazon trucks and stuff. That's a means of production in the sense that it's a means of getting something from one place to another and a means of doing business that he owns completely, that the state has no involvement in. He does his own shipping, let's see, for the most part. Industries that create goods, yep, those are means of production, especially the physical industrial machines that do that work. The people who own those own the means of production. The people who own the resources that go into that own the means of production. And then the rest of the people underneath have to scrap for some kind of integration into that pre-existing system that that one person might own. It's a great example. So that's a couple of good examples of what the means of production are. Every single one of us undoubtedly participates in capitalism. There are very few people in the world today who are able to avoid participating in capitalism. Most of these people are incredibly isolated. You can talk about Amazonian tribes. Those people largely don't participate in capitalism, but even they sometimes buy goods from local communities, which is a participation in capitalism. But since they own their own means of production, usually they're not participating. There are a couple quote unquote communist countries. Most of these countries still participate in capitalism. In fact, I would say all of them still participate in capitalism, even ones such as North Korea. North Korea still has a capitalist system. It's just a really brutal one. They basically are communist to their people and capitalist up top. So capitalism mostly dominates the world today. I think we can all agree. It is not an ideology. However, when we talk about capitalism, an important conversation in the modern day is that of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is stemming off of capitalism, but it is different because it is not just an economic system. Capitalism refers strictly to those economic principles, whereas neoliberalism is a whole set of ideologies, beliefs, and principles. Neoliberalism is a political project. So if capitalism is just saying, this is how we're going to run our economy, neoliberalism is saying, and this is why we're going to tell you all that it's important. This is how we're going to base all of our political moves off of capitalism. This is how capitalism is going to fully integrate in our modern society. Something in the chat. China's government is capitalism. Yes, absolutely. China's government is hilariously capitalistic for a government that continues to insist that they have a communist country. You can just look at the wealth striations in China to determine that you don't have wealth gaps like that in proper communism. We haven't really ever had a proper communist state in the modern era, so that's just kind of a disaster. Neoliberalism goes beyond just controlling our economy and what resources we have access to, and goes further. It fully informs the way that we think, feel, and participate in society. It informs what we value. As human beings in our modern era, in our neoliberal society, we tend to value things like productivity. How much did I get done today? Or what job do I have? How good am I at something? But that goodness is usually determined by marketability. Are you good enough at dance to be a professional? Are you good enough at being a teacher to get hired? That's generally how we think of things in terms, right? Or are you adult enough to be financially stable enough to move out of your parents' house? That's also neoliberal, right? All of these things are fundamentally based in our ability to participate in the economy. Neoliberalism trains us to think that way. If you just plopped a human down in a forest, that human would not be worried about marketability or whether or not they could sell all the things that they're hunting and gathering. You're worried strictly about survival. There are a couple of human civilizations that are fundamentally not capitalist. There's a couple in the Andes that are pre-Columbian, pre-colonialism that are communist by nature. So capitalism is not fundamental to human beings, even though it's dominated our society today. Neoliberalism as a system, however, is not as old as capitalism. It is mostly developed through the past 2 centuries, but especially in the past century. So post the 1929 Wall Street breakdown and the Great Depression, the people at the top of our capitalist society wanted to regain control. So post that Great Depression, you saw a resurgence in trying to move everybody into urbanization and industrialization. So people who lived in little communities that were entirely self-sufficient soon became reliant on larger communities and then eventually the state through things like roads, public access roads, right? Or industrial stuff. So you can only get this stuff from me and I'm only going to be the one to sell it to you. When we moved into innovating into things that only certain people can make, like only certain people who own factories can make metal work, for example, then the means of production began to consolidate and a lot of people at the bottom lost access to that form of life, if that makes sense. But especially since the 80s and the presidency of Ronald Reagan, our system has become more and more neoliberal. I'm sure that all of you today have some knowledge of how government is impacted by companies, right? Whether it be big tobacco buying off lobbyists to determine whether or not they're safe to trick consumers, or whether it's simple as the NRA being a money power and being able to buy off congresspeople, our system has become more and more entrenched in money. And in that sense, capitalism begins to take over your government and become neoliberalism. Capitalism integrated into the state is neoliberalism. So does everybody kind of get a general understanding of the difference between these two things? Speak now or forever hold your peace, because we are going to be jumping off of this assumption for the rest of the lecture. So if you have a question, ask it now. You can also ask it later, but if you have one, go ahead. Okay. So there are a couple ways that neoliberalism is negative. Of course, there are also a couple ways that neoliberalism is considered positive, right? You can argue that it drives innovation. You can argue that it keeps the economy afloat. Economies don't necessarily have to be neoliberal. You can argue that neoliberal is the best form for an economy. But today, since I'm teaching you how to read the CAPK, I'm going to teach you the negatives of neoliberalism, the extremely negative things that neoliberalism perpetuates in the modern world today that you can utilize against your opponents, but also that you should be aware of as an individual. So first of all, neoliberalism impacts our education system. First of all, under neoliberalism, only certain people have access to education. This changed a little bit when school became mandatory. K through 12 schooling became mandatory for most people. That was post-industrial revolution and post-neoliberalism. So that's a neoliberal reform. But in any case, our curriculum is still entirely pro-capitalist. You're rarely in one of your history classes going to hear somebody talk about anything good that happened under socialism or communism. Largely, communism is a disaster, I will agree, but socialism, democratic socialism, has actually been successfully executed throughout human history, but you're not likely to learn about that, and neither am I. You're going to have to learn that on your own. Additionally, the education system also aims to integrate students into the workforce seamlessly as soon as they leave school. So as soon as you leave, you get put through all these programs that help you go into a college and a career of your choice, into a career center, into what job skills are you learning? Oh, this is career technical education, a CTE, which you have to take in high school. All of these things prepare you to enter the economic system as part of the neoliberal cycle. And you can argue that's good or bad, but all I'm saying is that neoliberalism fully encompasses the educational system and doesn't allow for any outside perspectives, which tends to be a bad thing. The other thing that neoliberalism does, another example of neoliberal harm, is racialized violence, racial violence, anti-Blackness, racism, xenophobia. These things frequently stem from neoliberalism. If you think back, racializing bodies for capitalist exploitation led to slavery. Slavery was a capitalist institution because it was economically beneficial to people to enslave other people to do work for them for no pay. It was exploitation, it was absurd, and it is a fantastic example of how capitalism does horrible, horrible things to people. You continue to see this today with the perpetuation of the school to prison pipeline. So stemming off of education and now racialized violence, when people leave school, if they don't immediately jump into a career or into school, disproportionately, those people end up in prison. And prison can exploit their labor because there is a loophole in the 13th Amendment. There's also queer phobia of gay people, trans people, bi people, LGBTQ people generally, queer folks. Since queer people, I talked about this in my queer theory lecture today, so this might be a bit much right now, if you haven't heard about this before, but queer folks may not be able to produce children, right? If you have a cisgender man and a cisgender man living together, they may not be able to produce their own child, at least traditionally. Since they can't do that, they technically are not creating more people to go into the neoliberal system, and they're not as easy to exploit because they're not having to take care of people who can't work themselves, which puts a heavy financial burden on them. For this reason, traditionally, going back to the 19th and 20th centuries, queer people faced a lot of discrimination from the state, stemming from this inability to be exploited during the Industrial Revolution. Somebody in the chat, what is that loophole and how does it affect society? There's pretty much a loophole that says that prisoners in our prison system can be exploited for labor basically for free, which of course with private prisons, again, owning the means of production, incentivizes people entering the system. Yeah, I see a hand raised, go ahead.
So I wanted to add on to what you said. So basically in the Kritik Amendment, it says that this cannot be instead unless they have committed a crime. So basically what it did is they took prisoners and things that were criminals, yeah, justified to be in bondage according to the Kritik Amendment. This is why they had a lot of issues like the war on drugs and many of the population of American countries in the prison system and all those things that are basically motivated by curriculum.
Exactly. Yeah, so the loophole, like he said, allows people, basically it says no slavery unless you've committed a crime, which means that people can legally, under the Constitution, still be enslaved if they go to prison. That's capitalism. Like, so obviously, huge problem, right? We also have ableism under the capitalist system. If somebody with a disability is seen as less productive by the capitalist system or can't as easily integrate into the career field or can't as easily become a worker for the capitalist system, they're going to be frowned upon and disenfranchised by that capitalist system because they're not as easy to exploit. There's also environmental issues stemming from capitalism, which we all know. The world has finite resources. Capitalism continues to grow exponentially at all times. Capitalism is based entirely on growth that is unsustainable. We continue to take resources out of the earth that the earth cannot replenish because capitalism can't just live on a flat line. It has to keep going up. That's just how it's structured. So it takes a huge toll on the planet, and it's inevitably going to do really irreparable things. War and colonialism. Think of America searching for oil. Yeah, go ahead, Kessler.
Does this sort of say like global warming, and also because there's a lot of oil and coal demands, so then it really hurts. First of all, it hurts the natural resources, and second of all, it causes global warming, a lot of smog, and the side effects is sometimes it's really not productive.
That's exactly right. So for hyper-capitalist societies like America, India, and arguably China, because really China acts capitalist, you'll notice that their impacts on those countries' impacts on the world environment tend to be far worse. The more capitalist your country is, the worse the environmental regulations tend to be, because it is better for capitalism for there to be no environmental regulations. The other thing that capitalism and neoliberalism cause are war and colonialism. There are plenty of wars that are not caused by capitalism and neoliberalism, in my opinion, because I believe those things are just part of human nature. But if you look at colonialism, America seeking oil for profit has been the cause of so much tension in the Middle East. It is unbelievable, but that's a discussion for another day because it'll take forever for me to explain the whole history to you. But also just straight up colonialism. I mean, when you have people coming to the Americas to look for gold and exploit the Aztecs, like the Spanish came to do that first, that was purely capitalistic in nature. What is that? Some countries are going to reverse face. Yes, and those tend to be actually democratic social countries, like in Northern Europe. Okay, so now we kind of have an idea of why neoliberalism might be bad, right? Neolib is problematic because it boils complex human beings down to their ability to produce for the state, which seeks to profit off of them. You and I are so much more than our ability to produce, but when we enter society, our value and our ability to live is stemming off of entirely what we are able to produce. Neoliberalism is insidious because it seeps into our culture and becomes part of the way we think. Not only does it determine whether we live or die, how we live or die, and when we live or die, but it also determines how we think about other people. Let's see, right? You might be like, oh, that person's so lazy. Does that make them a bad person, or are you just thinking about capitalism? Some countries, yeah, Beijing is doing a good job. Okay, let's see. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to talk about the next part of the lecture now, if we all have an okay understanding of capitalism. And again, that was all very surface level. I encourage you all to look deep into the impacts of what capitalism has caused, and I can recommend literature to you all and files for you all to read. It would be impossible for me to cover that all, plus how to read K, in an hour lecture, so I'm not going to do it. But I fully encourage everybody to look into the many, many different impacts of capitalism. I've only given you a small handful of the many things. Okay, how and when to use the CAP-K? The CAP-K is very strategic as far as critiques go, because it is very difficult to avoid participating in neoliberalism, like I mentioned earlier. Every single one of us is doing it by being on the Zoom call. You know why? Because Zoom is a capitalist production. Zoom privately owns our means of doing this. And I know that because my university pays them so that I can host Zoom calls. So just as an example, even when you go to a debate tournament, all of you are going to be fundamentally participating in capitalism. It's unavoidable to some degree, right? But that means you can exploit and use that against your opponent if they're doing something outrageously capitalistic. So everybody might know a little bit about the structure of a critique, but just as a refresher, I'm going to give you the 3-point structure of a critique. A critique is like a disad followed by a counterplan, disadvantage, counterplan. You start with a link. What did they do wrong is what a link is, right? What is it that they messed up? What are you calling them out on? What did they do in this case to prop up neoliberalism, to perpetuate neoliberalism, to continue neoliberalism, to endorse it? So the link is always, what did they do that you are criticizing? Next is the impact. What does that cause? Not even just directly, not just what does the AF do that's bad, but also what does the system that they're endorsing do that's bad, right? So they're guilty not only of the things that they directly cause, but also the system that they're complicit in. So what impacts are there to neoliberalism? Well, I already gave you 6 today, and there's innumerable more amounts. Almost every problem that you can think of, you can figure out a way to tie to neoliberalism, just because, like I said, it touches everything today. So choose one of those many effects that I gave you and make it the impact for the critique. Finally, you have something called an alternative, which I'll cover in a separate part of this lecture, which is how you intend to resolve the issue to some degree. How do you intend to push back against neoliberalism if you can determine that it's a bad thing? If you prove that neoliberalism is bad, which is the impact, and if you prove that they're doing neoliberalism, which is the link, then how are you going to resolve it, which is the alternative? Does everybody have an understanding of the 3-point parts of a critique? If you want to ask any questions about it, go ahead. Okay, now I'm going to move on. And by the way, you don't have to raise your hands because I can't see all of your faces at the same time. So if anybody's been raising their hand and I haven't seen it, I'm sorry, but just blurt it out because I just can't see you. I can only see like 4 faces at a time or something. Okay. So here are a couple of common links. Sorry, that's written sideways. Common links to neoliberalism. So remember, link is what you're critiquing. So we have a couple of like, abbreviations for these links. So when the link is that they're utilizing a neoliberal state, we just call it a state link. So I'm going to start with that one. It's considered usually a weak link because it's kind of like the default. Like everybody kind of has to use the federal government if they're going to read a policy for example. So it's considered weak because it's just like, yeah, duh. But anyway, since the state, like I said, is fundamentally neoliberal because neoliberalism is the state integrating with capitalism, utilizing the state to accomplish your goals, so passing laws, using federal action, using the courts, means that neoliberalism and utilizing neoliberalism is part of your methodology and that you are complicit in neoliberalism. This is the argument that we make, right? So if somebody says, I'm going to ask President Trump, like my policy, my plan is, resolved, President Trump should pass this. You're like, okay, why are you continuing to give power to President Trump? How about we just like take down that institution, right? So when you're like, oh, President Trump should abolish ICE. How about you're just like, how about we threaten ICE until they go away instead because President Trump is inevitably going to come up with some way to keep ICE, is the argument being made there, that the state is fundamentally neoliberal. Again, it's not a fantastic argument usually, but it is a good bonus argument to have, and it's in almost every CAPK. Next is the discourse link. This is you saying that the affirmative's education within the room, that their way of speaking is pro-neoliberal and thus bad. If they are saying, oh, there was an immigration topic for policy, a lot of affirmatives would get up and say, we want immigrants that are productive. We want immigrants that are specialized and can do jobs. That's problematic, right? Because plenty of people need a place to go, even if they're not like professionals, right? So the argument to be made there would be that like saying that there's a good immigrant, like an immigrant that's better than other people because they can do things in the capitalist system, necessarily excludes people who might not be able to participate in that capitalist system, whether it be because of lack of education, disability, whatever you want to say. Those people might not be able to participate, and you're discriminating against those people by using pro-neoliberal rhetoric and discourse. Does that make sense? Give me some head nods or head shakes. Okay. Next we have the economy. Pretty straightforward. Our economy is neoliberal. So affirmatives that emphasize improving the economy at the cost of doing other things. So if you're like, hey, if you do that, it's gonna cause like structural violence, like one that I would talk about is the affirmative would be like, oh, we need to make all these production plants. And I would say, hey, if you do that, it's going to like run into indigenous land and you're going to build that stuff on Native American land. And that's bad. And they would say, okay, but we need to save the economy though. If you're prioritizing the economy over human lives and structural violence against people, then you're being neoliberal, and that's bad. And it leads to more neoliberal violence. Prioritizing the economy above all else is a major principle in neoliberal societies that leads to a lot of damage to individual people, right? Because if the economy is more important than people, but the economy is supposed to support people, then we've kind of just started valuing money over people. finally, we have competition. And these are, you can do way more than any of these links. These are really, really general ones that just came off the top of my head. There's a specific neolib link for like every single argument. Sorry, I get a drink of water. Okay, I'm losing my voice a little bit. Competition can be construed as a neoliberal ideology because rather than working to make everyone thrive, you're making people, like rather than working together to make everyone thrive, competition in neoliberalism specifically ensures that resources are systemically unevenly distributed. So for example, Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the world right now, I think, and he is going to be a trillionaire by next year, which is just crazy because one person can never spend that much money in their entire lives, but at the same time, other people are having to make GoFundMe pages to pay for cancer treatments. Now, do we think that Jeff Bezos is a fundamentally better person or that he's fundamentally a harder worker than every other person on earth? No, he's not. I mean, there's just no way. First of all, he seems like a butthole. And second of all, he's just not any better than anybody else. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add to your statements?
Go for it.
There are many people in poverty. There's sickness, disease, stress. There's a lot of poor people in the world. Jeff Bezos doesn't even do anything to help the world by just assisting these types of people. People trying to sort out the diseases by donating money, but yeah, that's what I'm saying. He's not
Right. Even though it would be easy for him. You can't rely on people to do good things just because they feel like it. There are a lot of wonderful people in this world who do good at every turn they can, but you can't trust that billionaires will always do the best thing, or trillionaires soon. So Jeff Bezos is not a fundamentally harder worker than anybody else, yet he has way more money. So how does that happen? Well, there are fundamental structural inequalities, which are the impacts of neoliberalism I talked about earlier: racism, ableism, sexism, arguably, anti-queer, whatever. All of these things are fundamental structural inequalities, right? If you're already in poverty, it is so much harder to work your way up. And so neoliberalism creates an unequal system where resources will always be unevenly distributed, no matter how hard people work, because everybody's working hard because everybody wants to have a nice life. There are very few people in this world who are just like, whatever, I'm not going to work hard for it, right? Most people are fundamentally hardworking. Okay. So why does it matter that they're being neoliberal? Well, I already covered a lot of different impacts, but you might be asking like, well, just because the affirmative says that the US should be competitive, that doesn't mean that they are neoliberalism, right? That doesn't mean they're solely responsible for it. They're not the only people in charge of neoliberalism, quote unquote, right? If neoliberalism already exists, why does it matter that they participate? All of us participate, right? So why does it matter that they're doing it too? Well, every neoliberal action we take unnecessarily when there's an alternative action that we can take makes us complicit in that violence. So every time that there's a structural inequality that we decide to perpetuate instead of addressing, that's neoliberal violence. An excellent example of this, and I'm totally forgetting this lady's name, but the lady who saw, oh my God, she was walking her dog in the bird watching part of Central Park. And there was a black man who said, can you please, I think they're both their last names were Cooper, I'm blanking. He says, can you please, do you know their names?
So the lady is I don't recognize them. The lady is Ann Cooper.
Yes, that's her.
And then what happened that the guy was working and the lady was supposed to bring opposition and the guy asked the lady to please move so he can go after his government and out in that area. And the lady got offensive and she used her white privilege to like call the police and air all down after that.
Yeah. She threatened him by saying, I'm going to call the police and tell them that an African-American man is harassing me, because she knew that there was a structural inequality, because she knew that the police would treat him worse than they would ever treat her. And so she was participating in that neoliberal system of discrimination knowingly. And that's awful. And could have had horrible consequences for him, and thank God he's okay. But it's just, that's an example, and the affirmatives obviously aren't doing the same thing by just reading something, right? But every small thing that we do to participate in neoliberalism helps us all normalize that system and become very used to it, and become used to those structural inequalities, and begin to think that they're okay, which they're not. So additionally, that's obviously a huge issue, but there's even more than that. Even on a debate level, if the problem that they're trying to solve is actually caused by neoliberalism, then participating in neoliberalism cannot be the solution. So if they're saying, well, let's see here. Oh yeah, go ahead, Kessler.
Can I add on? So, just saying that participating in neoliberalism is worse if you know what you are doing.
I agree. So when you inform your opponents of them doing something neoliberal and they continue to do it anyway, right? It's like, I just told you and you like dug your heels in. Are you serious? Right. So that's problematic. But if you are trying to solve a problem, so let's say you are trying to solve, well, the policy topic this year is about criminal justice. So let's say you are trying to solve people being put in prison unfairly, right? And your solution to that is to improve the economy somehow, so quote unquote less people commit crimes or whatever. Oh, there's too many people in prison. Let's improve the economy so less people go to prison. Well, the problem with that is you're further empowering those people at the top who want people in prison. So the cycle continues to be perpetuated. You can't solve neoliberal problems with neoliberal solutions. You have to come at it from the outside, which is why we have your critique, right? In debate, we call this turning the affirmative, because you've taken their solution to the problem and said, no, you're causing your problem. So you're turning them around, turning the F. You also call this finding the root cause of their problem. They might not know that their problem is caused by neolib, or we abbreviate neoliberalism to neolib and capitalism to cap. So I'm sorry if I do that. I'm just used to doing it in debates. We call this finding the root cause. They might not know that the problem they're trying to address is caused by neolib, or they might not care, or they might just be like, it's just a debate. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all just competing. But you identifying the root cause means that you're saying they're not addressing the root cause, which means they can't actually solve the problem, right? You're just putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. We have to solve the bullet wound. We have to do stitches, right? That's the best metaphor I can think of, is there's a deep tissue wound, and the affirmative is saying, we'll just put a little tape on it. It'll be fine. No. We have to address the internal bleeding first, and if they're choosing to ignore the internal bleeding, then you're gonna die. So that's why we address root causes in debate. I'm going to give you another Karl Marx quote before I move on to talking about how to come up with the alternative, the third part of your critique. Karl Marx also says that revolutions are the locomotives of history. Normally I would have you talk about this, but I'm running low on time because I take forever to explain everything. So feel free to shoot stuff into the chat about what revolutions come to mind for you that were locomotives for history. What during the history of the world have revolutions changed? Feel free to throw it out there in the chat because I would love to read them. So, you've identified the problem. The problem is neoliberalism. The problem is that the app is perpetuating neoliberalism and thus perpetuating neoliberal impact. So, sounds in the chat. Yep, French Revolution, golden example. I mean, honestly, changed the course of all of history. You've identified the app as being neoliberal. You identified that neoliberalism is a terrible problem. What now? What's the solution? You need to identify and defend an alternative way to address their problem. I'm going to give you a couple examples of how to do that. I'm going to give you first a couple examples of continued anti-capitalist resistance. Yes, Russian Revolution is a great example. Thank you, Theo, for sending that in the chat. The Russian Revolution changed the entire course of human history. Actually, very crazy. Have issues with communism? Is that your question?
It's capitalism.
That was it. I can't hear you.
And
socialism.
Yeah.
And socialism. Well, first of all, everybody is kind of in our modern society brought up with a capitalist mindset, all that neoliberalism what I was talking about earlier. And in our education system, I don't want to use the word brainwashing or propaganda because people are going to blow the whistle on me for being a communist. But our system teaches us that capitalism is the one true way for humans to operate, which it isn't. So when we have this McCarthy era of everybody being so anti-communist, first it was because communists were our enemies at the time, and we still fear communism today because we had so much war against communists, war and strife against communism itself. And the other reason is because our neoliberal society is afraid of what communism and socialism might mean for deconstructing what already exists. So like you'll see people are so anti-Bernie Sanders, calling him a communist because he wants to have democratic healthcare. At the end of the day, I don't know why people are so scared of having free healthcare. The real answer is that they think it's not possible under our capitalist system. And we've kind of all been taught by the government that it's not possible because they don't want to pay for it. And so the short answer is that we are taught that communism and socialism are a bad idea because our government doesn't want to do it because it's less beneficial for the people on top who already have a whole bunch of stuff.
Also,
and that's not to sound like...
could I expand on that from a poli-sci viewpoint? So when it comes to our political cultures, so for instance, I'll give you the example of the state of Florida. The state of Florida, one of the largest voting blocks in that state are migrants from Cuba. And a lot of them left Cuba because of the result of famine and hunger because of the failures of the capitalist state under Castro, right? And so when Biden basically when Bernie made the statement at the end of February that like we can't discount everything that happens in communist systems because like for instance, everyone was literate in Castro's world and people aren't literate right now in America. Like it shows there are some level of advantages to a communist system. And because of that, it led to American voters, and the majority of Democratic voters are very cautious people when it comes to policy-wise. And so they saw that and were like, oh, Bernie's going to lose us Florida. We can't back someone who will cause us to lose Florida, because that statement basically made it so Bernie could never win the majority of the Cuban voting population, and that voting bloc determines the outcome of elections in Florida. And Florida, for the most part, determines the elections of the presidential system because of the Electoral College, which is inherently based in xenophobia, fascism, and capitalism, right? So all this ties back to these specific issues.
Exactly.
That's true, but I feel like I understand like I understand why someone will not appreciate communism. That I understand. But however, when I look at Bernie Sanders and his idea of socialism,
So
I think for the most part, if you look at his policies, most of his policies like the issues that we have today, like healthcare, education, like policies that have been used for generational basis. But at the same time, it can be a bit overboard. But I feel like with his policies, I really think take the whole policy. I feel like there's a lot of it that we can incorporate in the U.S. system.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also people, because of what Amanda said about the education system earlier, automatically connect socialism with communism. And then when people bring up the example of these Scandinavian countries, their response is it's such a small country, it can never be feasible on a large scale. Which is pretty invalid because if you just think about it from a logical standpoint, they're very culturally similar to us, other than that one major difference.
Yeah.
You can scale anything up. And I should emphasize also that there are many civilizations around the world in history, aside from just that part of the world, that have practiced very socialist ways of living. Like I said, in the Andes previously, it was a very communist way of living, pre-Columbian, where people would share all of their resources, basically compile everything and say, take what you need. And so there's this myth that there's this homogenous way of being a human society. That it's always been this way and that it will always be this way, and that humans are fundamentally capitalistic, and that trying to do anything else leads to disaster because it's not in human nature. And while I am a fundamental believer that human nature corrupts most government systems, humans are not fundamentally capitalist. I do think that humans are fundamentally maybe greedy. A lot of humans are, I think. And I think that's just biology and evolution, right? Because you have to be greedy to survive. That's Darwinian. But I also should emphasize that plenty of human societies have been able to work their way around that, and find balance with the natural world and find balance with each other, that doesn't involve competition. And there are definitely ways to do that and to integrate that into our modern society.
And if people were fundamentally capitalist and that was their nature, you wouldn't see like people go into teaching at all, because like you wouldn't see people doing altruistic career paths.
Right.
When they could be making a much more in the public sector. Like me spending time coaching the program that I was a part of, I could be making much more like private coaching and stuff, but I value the altruism of like encouraging education that mattered a lot to me. And I think stuff like that is how you break the bonds to a degree of this anarcho-capitalist society where that's the only thing that matters.
All right, so like knowing that a lot of people in the US, like I know a lot of people have very capitalistic mindset when it comes to ideas. So I was in debate and like I wanted to bring up a socialist idea. How do I bring that up without sounding like I'm kind of a communist?
Yeah. Everybody's a communist or a capitalist, right?
Yeah, for my personally, like, if I wanted to bring up an idea that's socialist in my debate, how do I bring that up without sounding like communist?
Without sounding like a communist? Yeah, it's a good question. It's valid. Because your opponents are going to be like, oh my God. You just got to be like, hey, and it depends on what type of debate you're planning on doing. If you're doing policy, you can literally bring it up in a critique structure. Like I mentioned earlier, you can just be like, hey, you're doing something problematic. Here's why neoliberalism is bad. And then at the end say, we're not endorsing communism. However, we do think that there are solutions to be had. When you read your alternative, you can clarify, we are not endorsing communism. I am not a communist. Communism is bad. We agree with you if that's what you believe. However, we think that changes can be made outside of being capitalist or communist. And we think that things can change and things should change. You can make that argument. Inevitably, there is no way to avoid your opponents accusing you of being a communist because it is strategic for them to do so because it benefits them, and humans are fundamentally greedy, right? They want to be like, no, you're a communist, Valdi, because Valdi, right? And because I win the debate if you are. I want to say your name. Sorry, I'm trying to learn everybody's names because I feel like if I'm going to be teaching them, but yeah, they're going to be like, huh?
So basically, I have to prove that I'm not communist.
Yes, pretty much. I'm sorry to say it. It's definitely a problem I had a debate. You're just going to have to be like, that's not what I'm saying. You're a liar. I'm saying this. Don't like tell me what I'm saying. I'm telling you right now, like say it in your first speech that you bring it up. Just be like, I am not a communist. Do not call me a communist because you will be wrong. That's what I like to do. I also, when I didn't want somebody to say something to me in debate, I would say, I dare you to say it, because it really freaks people out. So I would be like, I dare you to call me a communist. I dare you. And they'd be like, what is she going to do if I call her that? I'm not going to call her that. Right? They think I'm going to do something like evil. Yeah, so just seriously, just be like, no, I'm not, and I dare you to call me one. I'll punk you on it.
And in lay debate, it's just framing. My favorite example is Andrew Yang, who basically was able to propose a policy that's like pretty socialist and get like a bunch of very capitalist people to come on board by calling it the freedom dividend. And
that's crazy.
And you utilize conservative capitalistic rhetoric to forward liberal policies.
Yep.
And so like that's what I did when I competed in congressional debate. I would advocate for very leftist things by utilizing the capitalistic framework and showing how this would actually make like capitalism better.
Yeah.
And so it's just about how you frame things. You can frame something in a way that's super progressive in a way that it appeals to moderate people. I do this all the time when I'm having to deal with like old school moderate to conservative people when, you know, having these conversations. And I think that's one of the most important things is just framing in a way that's accessible to them, but you aren't giving up your full argument and what is genuine to you, right?
So,
It takes a lot of skill to do, but I can help you with that.
so basically what you do is to send a socialist, I can put a socialist idea, hypothetically, into a capitalist framework.
Yep. Framework.
That's all that matters.
All
All right, I'm gonna have to let you guys go
See ya.
because I have to go run and do another. I actually have another coaching commitment. Oh, my life is so fun.
Have fun.
But I already sent my email out in the chat. So if any of you have any questions, please email me all day. Like I will just sit here and answer emails. I love talking about this stuff. But yeah, I gotta run for now. But thank you all for coming to the lecture. Thank you, Luca, for facilitating, and thank you, Alex, for facilitating such a great lecture. And thank you to everybody who asked such wonderful questions.
right. Thank you.
I'm gonna make like a baby and head out.
See ya.
See ya. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. All right, yeah.
See you in the next
Bye.
lecture. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
That was good. I think that'll
Yeah.
help in
Mhm.
tech rounds.
Mhm.
Okay, I need to find judges. Can you like message Robert or Avery and be like, hey, do you want to judge Parley at Yale?
October 2nd to 4th, right?
Yeah. No, it's 3rd to 4th. It doesn't start on
Oh,
Parley.
okay.
Just starts on the Saturday.
Yeah, okay. I'll message them.
See if one of them wants to do that. That way I can
Sure.
cover PF because I think
Yeah.
that
and
tournament's more tech for PF and they
Yeah.
want a more techy judge.
Also, it looks like Adam's gonna compete with one of our friends, Henry. So I think he'll be doing Parley.
Okay, then we'll need 2 judges. Shit.
Two
Okay, well-
judges for 3 entries?
Yeah, it's 1 for every 2.
Oh, okay.
Or portion therefore.
Yeah.
So, and then policy will need a novice judge. Shit.
Mhm.
Okay, I'll figure this all out. And then Congress judge, I can annoy
Talk to Ben.
Ben. Yeah, I'll bug
Okay.
Ben. He's probably a yes. We'll figure it out.
Cool.
Um,
You can also start recording, by the way. I'm gonna cut all of this.
I already